Brilliant, thank you. I'll just wait for my slides to come up.
Got them?
Yeah, brilliant.
That's them, Sally.
Okay. Oh. Is the screen all right for you? It's gone a bit crazy my end.
Yeah, you can see the front slide.
Yeah, all looks okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Morning, everyone. It is fantastic to be here with you today. And a huge thank you to all of you for taking the time out to join this session. We really appreciate it. My name is Sally Taylor. I'm a Sustainable Procurement Specialist and I sit within DEFRA in the commercial function. I've been in a sustainability and commercial role for over 20 years, so lots of experience for many years, too many to want to speak about. And we're incredibly lucky today to have some fantastic speakers joining us, and I'll talk to you a little bit more about where they'll come into the session in a moment. I just wanted to touch on how topical it is to be having this conversation today. You just need to open the newspapers to see or go online and see all the issues around geopolitical conflicts, extreme weather events, resource scarcity and human rights violations. So it's really important that we're having this conversation. You might have also seen in your work or day-to-day lives escalating costs. For those of you who are coffee drinkers, you may have seen the escalating costs of coffee, for example. So what are we going to talk about today? So we're going to cover the session in two halves. First of all, we're going to talk about sustainability and global and business challenges. And we're going to hear some insights from Sam from the Department for Business and Trade and Matty from the Department for Transport, who are going to provide some information from their perspectives. We're then going to put the spotlight onto modern slavery. We're really lucky today to be joined by Miriam from the Cabinet Office, who's going to give a policy perspective. And we have the fantastic Michael Flagg from UK Parliament, who is going to give you a sneak preview into a modern slavery risk tool that we've been working on across government that we hope to launch in the next month or two to provide a bit of that practical application on how you address some of these modern slavery issues. If I could ask you to take one thing away from today, it would be the importance of changing the narrative on sustainability. Too often it's seen as a nice to have, a tick box or something to do afterwards, after the event. It really needs to be seen as fundamental to what we do. And there's many reasons for that. But one of the reasons is it interconnects with all the key business and commercial challenges that we face, but it's often missed. And it's also a key part of the solution. So not only does it help with cost savings, it helps build resilience, it helps drive economic growth. It's also good for the planet and it's good for society. So really important that we move it to fundamental in all our decisions and in the delivery that we follow. Right, my slide's not moving on. Why is that? Bear with me 1 second. Are you not moving? There we go. Right. Okay, so before we get into the session in too detail, I think it's really important to just come together in what we mean by sustainable procurement, because it can mean different things to different people. So I like to use the definition that's used in the International Guidance for Sustainable Procurement. It's derived from a UK government definition. And it's about procurement that has the most positive environmental, social and economic impacts possible across the entire life cycle. So that's raw material, extraction of raw materials, right the way through to end of use, and including those embedded within services. And it's about not only the positive impacts, it's also about driving down those negative impacts. So designing them out and mitigating and managing what we can't design out. It's about moving away from that linear economy, so that take, make, use and dispose traditional way of using and purchasing, to that circular model. So really valuing the resources that we're taking in and trying to make them last as long as possible. So I wanted to just pull together a couple of slides for you that I hope will give you a bit of a flavour of the global context. So the Global Risks Report from the World Economic Forum, this is the 2025 report. It's ranked by experts across government, academia, business, and wider society. And it helps to give a perspective on the expected key risks over the next 2 and 10 years. And if you look at the 10-year focus, you'll see that 7 of the key risks expected over the 10 years all relate to environment and people. So that's telling us straight away that businesses, government, society are really worried about some of the impacts that we're facing in the not too distant future. And we're already seeing issues cropping up regularly. The top 3, extreme weather impacts on the Earth systems, and loss of biodiversity and ecosystem collapse. The other picture I've got there is the Planetary Boundaries Framework from 2023. This is a really good pictorial view of the fact that we've crossed 6 boundaries. And those boundaries are key for regulating and regulation stability of the Earth systems. We depend on natural systems for resources, not only to produce goods and to support the services that we utilise, but to live. So the air that we breathe, 75% of it comes from oceans. The last quarter comes from the trees. So it's really, really critical for our own existence. However, overconsumption and that disconnection that we have from nature these days over time has resulted in a loss of sight to the critical role that nature plays on life on this planet. So if I just touch on biodiversity loss, we're in a period of accelerated decline. We have key species heading for extinction, and that's mainly due to human activities, so such as land use changes, pollution, and climate change. But biodiversity provides really, really important services to us: clean air, fresh water, good soil. It pollinates crops. It also helps us fight climate change and adapt to it. And it helps us protect us against natural hazards. It's very costly if you try to put a number on trying to replace those key services that we receive from nature. Extreme weather events. We're experiencing higher temperatures through our carbon emissions. We have increased frequency and severity of extreme weather events. So you'll have seen in the papers around wildfires and flooding. And there's huge economic costs to businesses and to individuals, both during the event and also the rebuild after the event, not to mention the social impacts from the trauma experienced. So really key things. And we're consuming too much as well. And I'll talk about that. I'll go on to talk about that in a moment. I think this slide is really useful as well, this infographic. I'm not going to go into all the detail, but it's a really good one that just illustrates quite simply the difference between a 1.5 degree future and a 2 degree future. And just that simple half a degree has huge implications. And it's showing us that we must do all we can now to keep to that below 2 degree future if possible, because that 2 degree warning will put much of all the things that we hold close at risk, like biodiversity loss, the food shortages, sea level rise, droughts and wildfires. And those global disasters not only will have impacts for us as individuals, but they impact our global supply chains, making much of what we do more difficult or actually impossible. Let me move over there. Right there. I'm just going to touch on resources. So we're facing a huge population increase. So 2.5 billion people by 2050. The World Bank estimates that we're going to need a significant amount of resources to meet that below 2 degree future that we've just talked about. And many of the critical minerals that we rely on for that digital and renewable future are in scarce supply. So there's some real challenges that we are going to face. And if you look at the periodic table I've got here, not only are we consuming too many resources, but those in the dark blue are resources that are expected to be extremely difficult or impossible to source within the next 50 years. Many of those are key to used in steel production, they're used in fuel cells, they're used in electrics, they're used in solar panels. So really important that we understand the impact of some of these issues that are facing us. I'm just going to stop there. Sam, are you on the call? And I'll hand over to you for some insights from DBT.
Sure, Sally. Thank you for the opportunity. And I do want to cover a couple of issues that you've already touched upon. But first, I want to give a little overview about the role NCP has in sustainability and promoting it. The NCP, UK NCP, is one of 52 NCPs globally. And we have two objectives. One is to promote the OECD guidelines for responsible business conduct for multinational enterprises. And the other is to host a venue for persons and communities who feel they've been aggrieved by a multinational enterprise that violated those standards, which are voluntary, by the way. Now, in that context, the UK NCP has had over 1/3 of all cases filed last year. 1/3. And by far, majority of the cases have alleged that multinational enterprises, including financial institutions, have violated the guidelines in relation to not conducting adequate due diligence. Now, it used to be that the allegations were brought against the alleged bad actor, someone who was creating some harm in the environment, someone who might be personally hiring people who violate their human rights. But now what we're starting to see is increasingly the respondent companies are institutions who have either funded or have somewhere downstream in their supply chain a company that would have violated either modern slavery or environmental prohibitions. I say modern slavery to encompass the human rights chapter of the OECD guidelines. But I think it's important because there are a number of challenges facing businesses. And I come to this from not a unique but unusual perspective, because for 5 years before I was here, I served in the C-suite for a multinational enterprise, a $6 billion a year logistics company. And we're confronted with developing policies and practices that would comply not only with the laws and regulations, but also with sustainability guidelines. And a number of challenges face the institution in this regard. Sally's already touched upon them. She has mentioned risk several times. And for a corporation, you're all about mitigating your risk. Risk of non-performance, risk of not meeting the deliverables under your contract, but also risk of liability and risk of non-compliance with even voluntary guidelines like the OECD guidelines. And so it's a big burden. And this risk has only been amplified over the last few years, in part because of the way the landscape is evolving, but also it relates to some even newer developments. I think Sally talked about opening the newspaper and seeing different issues about sustainability. One that flies under the radar, however, is the effect of tariffs on sustainability. I'm not saying anything about that yet, but obviously these are evolving. Now, how does that affect a company and their ability to meet their obligations on sustainability and also delivery of products? Well, it means that oftentimes now, many companies are going to have to change their suppliers. They're going to have to dramatically redirect their global supply chain, whether it's coming from parts of Asia or other parts that might have tariffs imposed against them, either reciprocal or other tariffs that are just reactive. Now, that means that all the things that the companies have had to do over the last several years to comply with sustainability, like researching your suppliers, managing that supply chain, asking those hard questions, and being able to validate that, many instances that has gone out the window. because now they have to get a whole new group of suppliers because the global supply chain is shifting. And I mention that because I think it's not talked about yet, but the impact will be felt. It will be felt on companies and governments, the impact of tariffs and what they're going to have on the global supply chain, and in particular, sustainability. So those are the main parts I wanted to highlight, is that companies face legal risk, but they also face risk before, like the NCP, if they don't comply with sustainability obligations. Now, their risk before the NCP isn't financial, but it is reputational. And that's a significant one for companies. And it's a tough road to hoe, but it's pretty much all I wanted to say about that topic. Glad to answer any questions at the end when there is a session. Thank you, Sally.
Thanks, Sam. That's really, really helpful, really insightful to get your perspective on some of those things. I'm just going to cover really quickly around some of the business challenges. I'll just pull out a couple of these, but I'll keep the information in the notes for you. I just want to make sure we've got enough time for Matty's insights as well. So there are, picking up on what Sam said, there are a number of business challenges, and I've set out a few others for you here. So price volatility and escalation, anything that affects a commodity, the supply or demand of a commodity will impact competition of resources. So whether that's pandemics or conflicts or drought or other extreme weather events, with the rising conflict that we'll feel from exacerbated by water and resource scarcity is going to impact. It's going to impact in the form of cost escalations and delays in the supply chain. Skill shortages, we've got many sectors that are suffering from skill shortages, and that will increase. I mean, construction is a key one with the aging workforce and the challenges around diversity. Damage to assets, as we move into needing to adapt to a changing climate, I think Matt is going to touch on some of this in a moment, we need to prepare for the damage to assets. Can things operate in a changing climate, in that hotter, drier, wetter climate? Are they able to operate? I always remember that in COVID, we had a very hot period and my phone stopped working. I couldn't use my work phone at all. So what other things are there that are going to be at risk in those as the climate continues to change? And then I'll just touch quickly on supply chain disruption as well, because we have a global supply chain. We're an import dependent nation. So extreme weather, conflict in the world is going to affect our supply chain. And you may have seen in the papers over the last year or so the issues around the Panama and Suez canals. And 90% of trade goes via the water. And because of the issues caused by drought and from conflict, a lot of the goods that would normally travel through those canals have had to be redirected, that have taken them a lot longer to get to their destinations and created a lot more costs as a result. So you can start to see how some of these things will impact supply chains. Matty, I'm going to stop there just to make sure we've got time to get your insights in. So I'm just going to pass over to you. I'll go onto your slides. Just tell me when you need me to move you forward.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks, Sally. So good morning all. So I'm Matty Wormold and I lead on sustainable supply chain management at the Department for Transport. So as Sally's kind of already alluded to so far, from a commercial perspective, particularly those of us who focus on sustainability, we obviously, everyone in commercial, to be fair, everyone is typically told to procure things that provide value for money. Now, that is not just about getting a good deal from a financial perspective, but it considers a lot of other factors, such as whether it meets the capability, it's innovative, it provides fantastic social value benefits, supports the SME community, whether it's delivered particularly quickly to meet urgent needs. Have you considered the resilience of the supply chain or the security implications? Now, this is all actually part of a sustainable procurement mindset, and it then further goes on to things like, have you got any modern slavery risk that you've mitigated when you're procuring? Is there an environmentally friendly alternative? Now, balancing all of these things is incredibly challenging, and it is very rare maybe even impossible that you could procure something that meets every single one of those considerations appropriately. And more often than not, our role in commercial is to balance those different risks, try and mitigate as many as possible through due diligence and risk sharing with the suppliers, as well as monitoring any unintended consequences of our choices and justifying those priorities. More often than not, some of those priorities that we might have are conflicting, and you've got to work out as a commercial professional which one is the priority and how you can mitigate the unintended consequences as much as possible across the whole value chain. It's not just about what you see in front of you, but it's about the whole life cycle all the way down, because the maleffects of what you've chosen to do might be felt actually further afield and the impact might be greater than you think. So I don't want to scare you, but I'll just outline a couple of real world examples of some of the things that we procure as the Department for Transport, where there are particularly bigger picture challenges further down the supply chain, particularly from a sustainability perspective. So the first one is about solar panels. So as Sally has mentioned earlier, the majority of the central government estate relies on the use of solar panels for its renewable energy. And in the DFT, we use solar for many of our welfare units on construction sites, in train stations, at service stations, and across the wider estate. So solar photovoltaic, or PV, is predicted to be the main electricity source by 2050, and it is a key part of the UK's roadmap to net zero. However, the procurement of solar panels is not totally sustainable, and a transition to this low carbon electricity makeup might have unintended consequences and additional impacts, both from an environmental and social sustainability perspective, further afield. So, for example, polysilicon is a key component of photovoltaic cells, which convert the sunlight into electricity in the solar panel. So 95% of solar PV modules rely on polysilicon. Now, China has over 80% of the market share of solar panel manufacturing, and that's at every single stage in the production process. Now, excuse my pronunciation here, but within China, the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region produces 35% of the world's polysilicon supply, and that's at the quality needed for solar energy, so quite a large proportion globally. Now, the Uyghur people are an ethnic group. They live in that particular region of China. They speak a Turkic language, and the majority of them are Muslim. And comparatively, 92% of the Chinese population are Han, speak Mandarin or Cantonese. Now, it has been reported that there are significant human rights abuses, such as forced labour, detainment in camps, even conversion therapies, and it is extensive across this particular region, specifically exploiting the marginalised Uyghur people. Now, while cotton and tomatoes were some of the first items to be linked to forced labour in that particular region, polysilicon mining has now been found to be sourced heavily from this region, and reports have been exposing the solar industry for operating in supply chains that specifically exploit the Uyghur Muslim community. Now, this example in particular showcases kind of the difficult balance that we've got between decarbonisation progress and modern slavery, and how there are often some significant trade-offs and unintended consequences that might be further afield, and we might not be easily able to see due to the visibility of our supply chains. Procurement managers need to be better auditing our suppliers, asking the difficult questions, as Sam said earlier, about where all our products are coming from further down the supply chain, particularly from a material and mineral mining perspective. Consider diversification of supply, shift towards ethically certified producers, and ultimately try and gain as much visibility of our supply chain as possible. But whilst this might seem easy to do, as Sam said, due diligence might raise costs, it might lengthen lead times, there might not be an alternative supplier available, and it adds to that complexity and that kind of balance board of sustainable sourcing. It's also worth noting that some of our suppliers have recently flagged to us that they have a different kind of definition for modern slavery versus ethical sourcing. So many of our suppliers, when they talk about modern slavery, they think of it from a UK perspective, because we have regulation that encompasses and defines what modern slavery is. Whereas in a lot of countries where there is kind of human rights abuses, there are ethical sourcing issues, modern slavery by our definition isn't illegal. So child labour, things like that, the amount of working hours, that might not be illegal in some different places. So it's not technically classed as modern slavery in the same category. So it's just worth flagging in case there's loopholes of you think you're mitigating modern slavery, you're asking all these questions, whereas your suppliers might define it in a slightly different way. So it's another element to think of. From a second perspective, we've got electric vehicles. So this is another example of unintended consequences and that bigger picture consideration of sustainability. Now, while they are a key part of the solution in terms of decarbonising our transport, they are not a silver bullet. They do not solve all of our struggles towards net zero, and they form only a very small part of a very big puzzle. So from a personal perspective, I own an EV. I did a lot of research into the benefits of owning an EV versus any sort of second-hand petrol car versus not getting a car altogether. From a carbon footprint perspective, I live in Bath. It's a very small city, but it's incredibly hilly. So relying on a bike to get around is not part of the question. Buses are all petrol based. They get caught in frequent traffic from a one in, one out road network. And all the trains to get outside the city are diesel because the route hasn't been electrified yet. Now, I have solar panels on my roof, so buying a second-hand EV was a viable option for me as a user and from a carbon emissions perspective. But you scale up that dilemma to a national scale, those considerations intensify. So most EVs on the market now rely on lithium-ion batteries, which also rely heavily on cobalt mining. EVs aren't the only thing that use cobalt. In fact, EV batteries account for about 40 to 50% of total cobalt demand. But things like smartphones, laptops, they're another 20%, the aerospace industry, another 20%. But for this example, I'll focus on EVs. So around 70% of the world's cobalt comes from the Democratic Republic of Congo, where child labour, modern slavery, unsafe working conditions are extensive. UNICEF estimates that about 40,000 children work in DRC's cobalt mines, many of which lack regulation. They have workers in the artisanal mines. They have workers extracting the cobalt by hand using basic tools. This means there's frequent injuries, fatalities due to the lack of safety gear. There's no structural support in the mines, so landslides are really common. There's toxic exposure. People have respiratory issues as a result. The issues are endless. Then another part of this is around 60% of the world's lithium reserves are found in what's known as the lithium triangle, which is a region in South America where Argentina, Bolivia, and Chile all meet. The lithium is extracted from brine pools beneath the salt flats using vast quantities of water, often requiring 500,000 gallons of water to produce just 1 ton of lithium. Now, this would be a huge environmental impact anywhere, but this region is particularly arid and local communities are relying on those water sources for agriculture and drinking. And as a result, they're suffering the most and all of the local biodiversity is weakening. You might think that modal shift to encourage people out of cars altogether and onto public transport might seem like a good way to mitigate those risks, right? But we've electrified the railway, we're using electric buses, we're electrifying the trams. The amount of lithium required is even larger because naturally the larger the vehicle, the bigger the battery, and the more lithium and cobalt is needed. So we do need to make sure that there is kind of a holistic view. We can't just focus on one solution because the unintended consequences are going to be huge. So it needs to be a big puzzle of different solutions. Now, both the lithium triangle and cobalt mining in the DRC are essential to meet growing battery demand, but obviously they do raise substantial ethical and environmental concerns. But sustainable development is a really delicate balance. So if we completely said we're not going to source anything from the DRC at all, well, that's taking away a valuable economic source for them. So they're not then going to be able to fund improved education, improved health and safety. They'll find alternative ways of getting that funding. So we need to make sure we're working together with our suppliers and initiatives such as the Responsible Minerals Alliance to support due diligence in sourcing conflict-free minerals, or the Fair Cobalt Alliance to shift market development towards cobalt-free development. All that sort of thing, so that we're not just saying, okay, we'll cut the funding tie and that will solve the problem, out of sight, out of mind. That's not going to fix the issue. So the last example I'll go on to, Sally, if you go to the next slide, thank you, is about steel. So this is very prevalent in the news at the moment. You'll just have a look at the Times or anything and it will be front page. People have used steel for decades. And today, steel is present in virtually every aspect of people's lives, from homes, hospitals, to roads, railway, any other infrastructure that ultimately provides the foundation for social and economic development. Steel is probably there. Now, once steel is produced, its life cycle is potentially endless. So if it's recovered after each product's life cycle, it is a permanent resource in society. It's 100% recyclable and it's quite easily recovered by magnetic separation. But the main source of steel's carbon footprint is in its production. So steel can be produced by two main methods, either using a blast furnace or an electric arc furnace, or EAF for short. The majority of steel is still largely made in coal-fired blast furnaces. They pump large amounts of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, and they contribute heavily to the carbon footprint of the UK, acting as one of the largest barriers to decarbonising the construction industry. Now, more than 80% of the UK steel is made in blast furnaces, mainly those of the two largest players, British Steel in Scunthorpe and Tata Steel in Port Talbot. Now, why is the environmental impact of these so bad? Well, it requires two main components, iron ore and coaxing coal, heavily relying on fossil fuels, so obviously emitting huge amounts of greenhouse gases. But iron ore is also a key component to production, and this comes mostly from locations such as Liberia and Brazil, where mining activity is associated with both huge environmental impacts, such as land degradation, pollution, loss of biodiversity, watercourse contamination, but also social impacts. So, for example, the Greater Caracas project in Brazil is one of the largest flows of iron ore in global trade. Now, this was launched in 1982 during the military dictatorship in Brazil, when the objective was to occupy the Amazon, encourage mineral extraction, agriculture and forestry extraction, and it is plagued with serious problems such as deforestation, land grabbing, conflict, and violations against indigenous people. EAF steel production predominantly uses steel scrap as the feedstock instead of iron ore, and if it's used alongside renewable energy or hydrogen, it can be a much more sustainable production method to green steel. But unintended consequences, it requires significantly less jobs. So when Tata Steel recently announced the closure of their blast furnaces to transition to EAF, almost 3,000 jobs in Port Talbot were lost, and they were the main employer of people in this region. Many would say that this was a terrible decision. It shouldn't be done. We need to protect those jobs. Ultimately, if the transition to EAF doesn't happen, projects will simply source steel from Europe instead, which is already being done because it's green steel, and the industry in Port Talbot would eventually fail anyway. So we need to make sure that we're supporting people in that area and doing a just transition so that those in carbon intensive industries aren't being further disadvantaged. So there is a lot of hydrogen development in South Wales, which is helping support people from carbon intensive industries to go into green industries and help promote economic development and skills in any case. So just thought I'd give you a few examples. It's not all bleak. We just need to have a bigger picture consideration and try and monitor some of those unintended consequences and manage that whole big picture of sustainability. You can't just say, oh, this is low carbon, so it's sustainable, because there are impacts much further afield or even closer to home that just need to be considered effectively. I'll hand back over to Sally, I think.
That's amazing. Thank you, Matty. Absolutely fantastic, all the facts that you're able to put across there in such a short space of time as well. So thank you so much. It leads us nicely into a segue onto modern slavery. We will touch on at the end some of the practical things to consider, just so that you know, as Matty's talked about, you know, that wider picture and how you can start to think about some of these things in your day-to-day work. Right, modern slavery then. I'm going to rush onto it because otherwise we'll have no time for questions, and then you'll all tell me off. So let me see if we can whittle through some of the slides on this. So what is modern slavery? It's the severe exploitation of other people for personal or commercial gain. It's a serious violation of human rights. It's a global problem and it's an international crime. There's over 50 million people that are affected worldwide, and we have many victims in the UK, and we've had many instances of modern slavery in the UK. Victims are controlled by force, threats, coercion, abduction, if I could speak, fraud and deception. There's a bit of a myth that it's only certain people from certain backgrounds that fall victim to modern slavery. It is a myth. Anyone can fall victim to modern slavery, and often at the most vulnerable points of life. Forced labour is the most likely form of modern slavery that we'll come across through our work. And modern slavery affects the most vulnerable of society, and it therefore interconnects heavily with the public sector equality duty and consideration of equality, diversity and inclusion. Right. And oops, going too far. Sorry, Miriam. And just a few stats here that I've put in here. You can reflect on it at a later stage as well, but I'll just pull out a couple here for you. So over 100,000 people in slavery in UK, thought to be a lot more. 1 in every 150 people is in slavery. Just think about that for a second. 1 in 150 people in slavery. That's absolutely crazy. There's 27.6 million people in forced labour globally. So that's the type, as I said, that we're most likely to come across in our work. 18% of forced labour is in construction. And as I said, we've had instances in this country, and there's some reports I can direct you to of some investigations and the outcomes from those. If anybody is interested, then please let me know, and I'll send you the links to those. It costs the UK economy a lot of money, and it's a gender crime as well. So there was a report to the United Nations in 2017 that cited that 71% of people in slavery are women. But there are differing figures out there that you may come across. And I'll leave you with this stat before I hand over to Miriam. But 1 in 4 victims are children. 1 in 4 victims are children. So Matty talked about Democratic of Congo, and there's a lot of children in forced labour in that country, sourcing those cobalt in those cobalt mines that we talked about. So it's a huge problem and something that we need to address. I'm going to pass on to Miriam now, who's going to give you a bit of a view from a policy perspective.
Thank you, Sally. Hi, everyone. I'm Miriam Kirchberger. I'm a policy advisor within commercial policy in the Cabinet Office. And as part of our team, we develop and implement new commercial policy, and we work closely with the Home Office in terms of kind of the modern slavery, forced labour policy area. And they obviously developed the Modern Slavery Act. And as many of you will probably be aware, it's been 10 years since the Modern Slavery Act was introduced in 2015. And one of the sections in that act was introduced to tackle the risk of modern slavery in supply chains. And it's often referred to as the Transparency in Supply Chain Requirements, TISC requirements. And it requires commercial organizations in the UK with a global turnover over 36 million to publish a modern slavery statement each year. So the structure of the statements is set out. It includes organization structure, supply chain, policies in relation to slavery, due diligence processes, risk assessment and management, and also elements such as KPIs and training. And the aim of these statements is very much to increase transparency and accountability. And if you could move on to the next slide, please, Sally. And while these requirements apply to private companies, we also recognize the risk in our own supply chains. And as government, as you'll see, based on the figure of the slide, we have enormous buying power. And with that comes a certain amount of responsibility. Which is why in 2020, we published the world's first government modern slavery statement, detailing the steps the UK government has taken to prevent modern slavery in its own supply chains. And since then, a progress report and a further cross-governmental statement were published. And if you could move on to the next slide, thanks. So that was a bit of background in terms of some of the policy, but in order to implement that policy, we recognize that contracting authorities need to have the capacity and tools and skills to undertake risk assessments and also manage those risks, especially for high-risk contracts. Which is why we and other departments have developed several products to support contracting authorities. The most high-level one is the Procurement Policy Note, PPN 009, and the associated guidance, and they set out the actions to ensure modern slavery risks are identified and managed effectively. And the guidance very much supports practical implementation of these policies. There's also a risk prioritization tool, which was designed to support departments to undertake high-level risk assessments for procurement and existing contracts, and it's aligned to existing policy, consolidating the risk data and also highlighting next steps and best practice. Another tool is the social value policy and previously the social value model, which require contracting authorities to consider how they could secure wider social, economic, and environmental benefits. And it goes back to what we've all been saying in terms of value for money, that we need to go beyond that. And in the social value policy, there's a specific section about identifying and managing modern slavery risks and potential activities that could be included as part of contracts. And when we come to the contract management stage, there's the modern slavery risk assessment tool created by the Home Office. And this tool has been designed to help organizations have those conversations with suppliers to improve protections of workers and also generally reduce the risk of exploitation. And last but not least, training. There are various training packages, particularly e-learning, specifically aimed at commercial and procurement staff. And looking at some stats, for example, 5,500 procurement professionals have completed the Home Office's modern slavery e-learning. But we also collaborate with wider industry and businesses to increase the knowledge around modern slavery. So that was a very quick tour of existing tools, and I'll pass back to Sally.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Miriam. That's really helpful. I'll just, before I introduce Michael from UK Parliament, I'll just cover a couple of elements in the modern slavery risk tool that Michael will talk to you about. So in the policy, in the procurement policy note that Miriam was talking about, and the associated guidance, it requires commercial colleagues and clients in the business to consider the modern slavery risk characteristics. And there's 6 characteristics which are listed up here. And I'll just talk through a couple of them that might not be completely obvious. So the one that talks about context-dependent risks, that's talking about the supply chain, any part of the supply chain through the tiers that the countries are involved in wars and conflicts, or have high levels of poverty and unemployment, or perhaps have lack of business and government accountability, or multiple of those may apply at the same time. Nature of the workforce, that is primarily talking about whether the workforce and the work that's being done is dangerous or physically demanding work, and whether there's high numbers of workers such as temporary or seasonal agency workers that we may find in, for example, agriculture or construction. It's also flags around isolation of workers, which can often happen in certain industries as well. In agriculture, again, is one of those examples. And then the other one I'll just flag is business supply chain models. So this is talking about those complex employee relationships. So where we might be relying on agency staff We might be outsourcing or bringing in some subcontracted workers, where we're focusing on profit margins and rapid turnaround times. Are we requiring things with a same-day service or a next-day service, and whether or not it's really necessary? So trying to understand the sort of context that we're working within. The tool contains a number of high-risk sectors, which I popped on a slide here for you so that you can come back and refer to these at a later date should you wish to. So these are the sectors listed in the policy note and also the GLA industry profiles. So one of the ones that may be a surprise to you is the recycling and waste. So there is a massive drive towards the circular economy, and that's the right thing to do for many different reasons, but recycling and waste is also a high-risk sector that needs to be monitored and managed. As well as high-risk sectors, there's high-risk commodities. So there are the Global Slavery Index have 5 high-value commodities that we have to consider. So that's garments, textiles, electronics, and fish. But there is also the US labour list of forced and child labour, which came into the policy requirements a couple of years ago. And that brings in another 204 goods from, I think it's over 80 countries or regions that, dependent on where they're sourced from, have specific risks of forced labour attached to them. So I'm going to pass over to Michael in just a moment, who will talk you through the tool that we've updated, that we've tried to update it in a way that brings some of this information into the tool so that you don't have to go out and find everything. It still doesn't cover everything we'd like it to, but we hope it will give some practical insights for teams and help them understand the risks to their procurements, but also the key next steps that they can take. And just before I pass over to Michael, one of the things that's really important here, if you do nothing else around modern slavery, is that sector understanding. So understand what the risks are to the procurements that you're working on. Design out the risks. We don't talk about this very often, but if we think about sustainability early enough, we have the opportunity to design out the risks. Can we change the way that we're buying something? Can we buy circular rather than new that's coming from these countries across the globe that we have very little influence over the labour issues in the countries of origin, and where we can't address, where we can't design out the risks, how do we build in those losing my trail of thought here, those social and ethical connections to manage the risks. And Michael will talk now about how the tool may be able to help people in their procurements. Michael, I'll pass over to you now.
Lovely, thank you very much, Sally. So before I show you the tool itself as is, and remember it is still a work in progress, we've still got about a month to go while we work on the final user feedback to get your final tool out there. I did just want to thank Sally and Matty for really exposing how complex the whole issue of both sustainability and social sustainability is. We haven't opened the can of worms, we're literally living in the can of worms. And because everything's so complex, that's why it's really important to have these tools that reduce that complexity. Before we had a PPN, which people could read through, people still can read through, of course, and had to really understand for themselves and work out what to do with all of that information. The tool that we've developed and built up from previous versions is really designed to take that PPN and really guide you through it by condensing it down into the salient points to identify the inherent risk. Now, it's different to the modern slavery assessment tool, the MSAT, completely different, which is why you'll see a different name on there. We've renamed it to the anti-slavery risk tiering tool to make sure that it doesn't confuse people between the two things. And the idea of it is to really, at the start of your procurement, look at that inherent risk of the area you're procuring in. And then afterwards, once you've selected a supplier, you can then change your answers and apply your mitigations and really see how what you've done has changed, but also you've still got more steps to go along. So I'm now going to share this with you, and Sally is going to let me know when everybody can see this.
I can see it now, Michael.
Lovely, lovely. So along the bottom, we've got 5 tabs, and these take you through the stages to get to your eventual output. Starts off with a brief overview. I'm sure everybody can have a look at that when they get the tool. It's just got some basic guidance and then some more in-depth guidance in the second tab, the input guidance. It looks at the various different inputs, those 6 inputs that there are. For example, the industry type, there's that list of different high-risk industries that Sally showed earlier. The real meat and potatoes, though, is here on the input tab. Now, I've already put in some answers to make this a bit of a quicker demonstration, but up at the top, we've got some basic information that you can pop in so that you can then use that and record your findings for each individual procurement. And then down here, we have the 6 different risk characteristics: industry type, commodity type, all of those that Sally showed you. I've put in some example answers in here. These drop-down lists here, each of these lilac boxes is a drop-down list. They show you your high-risk characteristics. So all the way from agriculture down to social care in the industry type, but you've also got multiple of the above, none of the above, which is essentially your low risk option, and then don't know, which is a high risk. If you don't know the risk, it's still a risk. So it takes all of those answers that are from the PPN. You can pop them in here, those options, into each of the relevant boxes, and it will give you an output risk. Something to highlight here is the typical supply allocation. I've given you one of each of the 3 outputs of that here. So at the top, we've got the Bahamas, which is in yellow, which has given us a little question mark here. Now, what that means is this country exists, but there's no information that we've got from the data sets to say what that risk is for that country. We use the Global Slavery Index and their estimated modern slavery prevalence per 1,000 people they do it by for each of these. But if a country that we recognize isn't on that list, we've still got it in there, so you can choose it, but it does highlight we don't know that risk. Then you've got a country such as Ghana. You could pop the UK in there, which according to the Global Slavery Index has a low prevalence, and a country such as Chad, just random countries that I've picked, that has a high prevalence. What we've done in here is you can all similarly search. That's the benefit of drop-down menus. So if, for example, I just wanted to put UK instead, it'll come up with Ukraine or UK. So I'd pick UK. UK is similarly a low prevalence modern slavery country. Low prevalence, not no prevalence. It is important to point that out. And then with your commodities, for example, if I chose electronics, because we've talked about electronics, it additionally comes up with information from the US labor list that looks at all of the various parts of the supply chain that are involved in that area, which have high risks of child labor and forced labor. For example, here it talks about all of the photovoltaic, the solar panel parts from China, and the fact that it is a particular issue there. And then on your output, it comes up, of course, headline figure. It's a high risk procurement with the answers that I've given you. You could also get a medium or a low. It gives you some next steps, and these are really key next steps that we have developed that have also come from the PPN across all of the different steps of your procurement. So it looks at the procurement strategy all the way through the procurement specific questionnaire, through to contract handover and contract management. Now these next steps change depending on the risk. And then at the bottom, there are some supplementary modern slavery questions that relate to the input that you've added in there. So it only gives the relevant questions that you can put into your procurement. And then finally, at the end, we've got a tab of some good practice, which, depending on the risk that is output, highlights in green the relevant parts, the relevant pieces of good practice here. Now, hopefully that was a nice quick tour of
Well, I've lost you, Michael. I don't know if it's the same for others or if it's just.
Yes, we've lost him.
Oh, okay, Michael. I'll take back control then, because we're over time. So I'll quickly close for everyone on the call. So just bear with me. Right. Well, thanks for bearing with us. I'm sorry we've overrun. We're all incredibly passionate about what we've talked to you about today, and unfortunately with that comes running over time. So please do excuse us. If you need to go, as was mentioned at the start, this session is being recorded, so you'll be able to access the recording afterwards. Right. I'm just going to close up then. So we've talked about some of those big global challenges, both in relation to sustainability, but also from the business challenges linked to those. There are practical steps you can take. I know it seems very overwhelming. The first thing you can do is to understand early what those key risks are within the sector that you're working in. So the best way to do that, I would recommend for those that use them, is to start thinking about that in your category strategies, because you can start to look at them there. You can look at the short, medium and long term of the market. You can understand where the market is at the moment and where you're hoping for it to move in the future. There's an opportunity for collaborative working. I mean, Michael and myself and a number of people across government have been working on that modern slavery tool. A lot of us will be coming across the same issues in the different categories that we're working on. So an opportunity to reach out to colleagues across government and wider, and talk to each other more and understand those risks and work collaboratively to move forward. We need to ensure that sustainability is central and core to governance and decisions within our approach. That's the biggest thing that I see in my role. Is it's so often it's, oh, can I just add a question in at a tender stage? You've missed all those influence points beforehand. And when I say you, I don't mean you, the commercial professional on your own. I mean you, the client, the business, all the people involved in the commercial activity, because it's a collective thing. You know, it starts way before commercial get involved. We should be thinking about those risks and those potential opportunities. Matty talked about the silo thinking. I have a couple of slides. I might include them in the wider pack when I send to you. My pet hate is silo thinking. It's so easily done, whether you're talking policy or whether you're talking, risks in the supply chain. So many people will look at carbon and carbon only, or they'll look at maybe they'll look at modern slavery only, or waste. We have to, whilst they're all really important issues, we have to. Even if we have a focus on carbon, we need to take that step back and understand, well, what are those other things? You know, Matty talked about solar panels. Yes, they're low carbon in use, but they're polluting to produce. You can't currently recycle them very easily, and there's all those human rights issues associated with them. So can we do things? We know we've got the challenges with conflict minerals, and we know we've got huge amounts of waste generation. Can we look to innovate and use technological advancements and work with markets to develop those solutions that recover those critical minerals so that we build resilience in our own country, and that we can build that economic growth and those skills and innovation on the back of it as well, reducing some of those wider global risks that we have less control over. And following it through that commercial life cycle is really important. I'll just finish on saying, you know, challenging that traditional purchasing. We can buy differently. We're so stuck in this way of buying the way that we always have done. We really need to step outside of that. And I know it can be challenging, and that it can be challenging within the business to do so. But looking at what's the outcome we need, and can we get to that in a different way? Quite often there's a different way to get to it, or the market might not be ready to do it yet, but you can start moving the market to that approach in the future. So building that into your category strategies. I'll add some notes in so that you've got something more to take away from you, because I appreciate we're a bit rushed. So I love this slide. You know, what's the challenge? It's our way of life that's the challenge. Sustainability interconnects with key business and commercial challenges that we face. Sustainability, if considered early, can be a key part of the solution. Cost savings, resilience, economic growth, all the things we've touched on across this piece today. My main takeaway, as I said at the start, is just starting to change that narrative on sustainability. You can't do everything yourself, but start to build your understanding, start to take small steps around this area and talk to those experts that you can in your field. Be part of the change. It might be a bit cheesy to say this, but every drop of water ripples out. So every one of you can lead the way on this, changing that narrative and making a start to that more responsible and resilient future that not only benefits us, but benefits the planet as well. So just think about what those actions are that you can take. I'm really sorry, we've completely overrun. I don't know if we can hold on for if anybody on the call wants to ask any questions, or I'm quite happy to collate them and catch up afterwards. I'll leave it for you to advise me. What do you think, Sam?
Sorry, Sally, we can gather any questions if MD wants to put them in the chat and I can forward them on, or if you want to put your email in the chat and people can maybe reach out if they've got any follow-up questions.
Yeah, that would be great. Then we can let people go as they need to. I'm more than happy for people to contact me, and I can coordinate with the presenters if there's any key questions. I just also want to thank the presenters. You know, we've got some incredibly passionate and expert people on this call who've put some time in at very short notice to help bring you their perspective. So thank you all to those involved. Really appreciate you taking the time, and thank you to everyone who's been part of the session and listened. I hope we've informed you and sparked something inside you that will help you move forwards going as you progress. So thank you very much.
Thank you all. Appreciate it. Materials will be uploaded at the end of the week from the sessions.